The wind in the Wyoming Territory of 1888 had a voice. It wasn't a whisper, but a long, mournful cry that swept down from the Laramie Mountains, carrying with it the grit of 1,000 barren miles. It scoured the paint from the sides of buildings, bent the stubborn prairie grass flat against the earth, and worked its way through the chinks in every cabin wall, a constant, chilling reminder of God's indifference. The sky was an immense, unforgiving bowl of blue, so vast it could make a man feel like an ant crawling on a dinner plate. Summer burned the land to a brittle brown, and winter buried it under a blanket of white so deep and silent it felt like the world's final breath. The town of Redemption Creek wasn't much of a town at all. It was a handful of weathered, gray-board buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the endless expanse. A general store, a saloon whose swinging doors groaned like a dying man, a blacksmith's forge that rang with a lonely, rhythmic clang, and a small, steeple-topped church that seemed to be perpetually praying for its own survival. Men passed through, trappers with furs, cowboys driving herds north, prospectors with wild, feverish eyes. But few stayed. The land didn't invite company. It tested it, broke it, and more often than not, sent it packing. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Caleb Thorne had carved out his existence. His ranch was a day's ride from town, a solitary homestead crouched against a low rise in the land, its back to the wind. Caleb was a man shaped by the terrain he inhabited, quiet, weathered, and self-contained. At 42, his face was a map of sun and hardship, crow's feet etched deep around pale blue eyes that had seen too much empty horizon. His hands were calloused and capable, as comfortable mending a fence or birthing a calf as they were holding a rifle. He was a widower. 5 years had passed since he'd buried Sarah, his first and only love, in the small plot behind the house, her body consumed by a fever that had swept through in the dead of winter. The silence she left behind was louder and more persistent than the wind. It was in the empty chair across the dinner table, in the unused half of the bed, in the hollow echo of his own footsteps on the floorboards. For 5 years, Caleb had existed, not lived. He worked from sunup to sundown, the physical exhaustion a welcome drug that dulled the ache in his chest. But when night fell, the silence returned, and the loneliness was a physical weight. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or romantic notions. Love, he figured, was a lightning strike, and it didn't strike the same place twice. What he needed was a presence, a warmth, the sound of another human being in the crushing quiet of the house. He needed a wife, not for passion, but for partnership, a helpmate, a cure for the silence. And so, with the same methodical resolve he used to plan his spring planting, he had done what other lonely men on the frontier did. He'd sent a letter, along with a modest sum of money, to a matrimonial agency back east. The correspondence had been brief and to the point. He described his ranch, his situation, and his requirements, a woman of good character, not afraid of hard work, who sought a stable home. He didn't write of love or affection. He wrote of mutual respect and a shared life. It was a contract, a transaction of needs. Her name was Marion. Her letters, penned in a neat, careful hand, told him she was 28, the daughter of a tailor who had passed, leaving her with little more than her good name. She had been working as a housemaid in Boston, a life of thankless drudgery. She wrote, plain but healthy, and sought only a respectable marriage and a home of her own. She enclosed no photograph, and he had not asked for one. A woman's face was less important than the strength in her hands and the fortitude in her soul. The day she was due to arrive on the stagecoach, Caleb rode into Redemption Creek, his stomach in a knot of unfamiliar anxiety. He waited on the porch of the general store, watching the dust devil that heralded the coach's approach. When it finally lumbered to a halt, a woman descended, clutching a single, worn carpet bag. She was just as she had described, plain, but not unpleasantly so. Her brown hair was pinned in a severe bun, and her dress was a simple gray wool, practical and devoid of ornament. She was thinner than he'd imagined, with a fragility about her that seemed ill-suited to this harsh land. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, sorrowful brown, and they seemed to be perpetually looking at something far away, something he couldn't see. She carried herself with a quiet, almost fearful modesty, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if expecting a blow. She did not meet his gaze directly, instead focusing on a point just past his shoulder. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible above the wind. "Ma'am?" he nodded, taking her bag. "Call me Caleb." The wedding was the following morning, a Sunday. The church was cold, smelling of dust and old wood. The preacher, Reverend Miller, a man whose faith seemed as weary as his face, recited the words from the good book in a monotone drone. The only witnesses were the general store owner and his wife, who stood awkwardly at the back. Marion wore the same gray dress, her hands trembling as Caleb slid a simple gold band onto her finger. She had no family to stand with her, no one to give her away. Her only dowry, offered to him the night before with downcast eyes, was a delicate silver bracelet, tarnished with age, its clasp loose. "It was my mother's," was all she'd said. There was no celebration, no feast. Caleb simply helped his new wife onto the wagon, and they began the long, silent ride back to the ranch. The house, when they entered, seemed to amplify the awkwardness between them. He showed her the kitchen, the bedroom, the small space that was now hers. She nodded, her sad eyes taking in the Spartan furnishings, the lingering ghost of another woman's life. That night was a study in restraint. He had waited, sitting on the edge of the bed, while she changed behind a privacy screen he'd erected in the corner. When she emerged in a plain white nightgown, she looked like a frightened child. They lay in the bed, the space between them a vast, cold territory. He was acutely aware of her shallow breathing, the tension in her small frame. This was his wife. This was the arrangement. He was a man with needs, but he was not a brute. He turned to her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but he felt it. "Marion," he said, his voice rough. "I mean you no harm. This is our home now." She said nothing, but turned to face him in the moonlight that streamed through the window. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. He saw in them not just fear, but a profound, bottomless well of sorrow that had nothing to do with him. It was a grief she had brought with her in that worn carpet bag. He performed his husbandly duty with a heavy heart, a quiet, somber act devoid of passion or tenderness. It felt less like a consummation of a marriage and more like the sealing of a contract. Afterward, he lay on his back, listening to the wind, while she turned away from him, her silent sobs shaking her body in the darkness. He did not reach for her. He did not know how. Monday morning broke gray and cold. Caleb rose early, as he always did, to tend to the livestock. When he returned to the house for breakfast, the smell of coffee and frying bacon met him at the door. It was a foreign, yet welcome, scent. Marion stood at the stove, her back to him. She had laid the table for two. They ate in the same strained silence of the day before. Her movements were efficient, the practiced motions of a woman long accustomed to serving others. Later that morning, as he was repairing a harness on the porch, he saw her through the window. She was sitting at the small wooden desk in the corner of the main room, writing on a piece of foolscap with a frantic intensity. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, the pen scratching audibly across the paper. She filled one page, then another. When she was done, she didn't fold the letter or place it in an envelope. She walked to the great stone hearth, where the morning's fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and she fed the pages, one by one, into the heat. She watched them curl, blacken, and turn to ash, her expression unreadable. Caleb frowned, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. It was a strange, secretive act. He walked inside, the clomp of his boots making her jump. "Writing a letter?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes were sharp. She turned, startled, her hand flying to her chest. Just thoughts, Mr. Thorne, getting them out of my head." "You can call me Caleb," he reminded her gently. "And you needn't burn your thoughts. There's no one to read them but the wind out here." A flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossed her face before she masked it with a faint, sad smile. "It is just a habit, a foolish one." She offered no further explanation, turning back to the kitchen, leaving him standing there with the distinct feeling that his new wife was a house full of locked doors, and he didn't have a single key. Tuesday dawned with a threat of rain. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind had a damp, raw edge to it. The morning passed in the same quiet routine. Caleb worked in the barn, and Marian moved silently through the house, cleaning and organizing with a grim determination, as if trying to scrub away the presence of the woman who had come before her. It was just past noon when the sound came, a frantic, desperate knocking at the front door. It was so unexpected that Caleb, who was coming up from the barn, stopped dead in his tracks. No one ever came to the ranch unannounced. He saw Marian freeze in the kitchen, a dish towel clutched in her hand. He reached the door first and pulled it open. On the stoop stood a young woman, or perhaps a girl. It was hard to tell. She was soaked to the bone, her calico dress plastered to her thin frame with a mixture of rain and mud. Her blonde hair hung in wet, tangled clumps around a face pale with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes, wide and terrified, were the same deep brown as Marian's. She was shivering violently, her knuckles white where she gripped the doorframe for support. Before Caleb could speak, Marian let out a small, strangled gasp from behind him. "Eleanor?" The girl's eyes found her sister's over Caleb's shoulder, and a wave of raw, desperate relief washed over her face. She took a staggering step forward. Caleb instinctively put out an arm to steady her, his mind racing. A sister? Marian had never spoken a word about a sister. Marian stood as if turned to stone, her face a mask of shock and something else, something that looked like dread. She didn't move forward to embrace her sibling. She didn't utter a word of welcome. She just stared, her lips parted in silent horror. Caleb's gaze hardened with suspicion. This was not a joyful reunion. This was an intrusion, an unwelcome complication to the simple life he had so carefully arranged. "Marian," he said, his voice low and firm. "You have a sister?" Marian's eyes darted from the girl to Caleb, a panicked animal caught in a trap. She seemed unable to form words. It was the girl, Eleanor, who spoke, her voice a ragged, trembling whisper. "Please," she begged, her eyes fixed on Caleb. "Please, sir, don't turn me away. I have nowhere else to go." His first instinct was to say no, to send her packing. This was not part of the bargain. He had married one woman, not taken on her entire family, but looking at the girl, shivering and caked in mud, looking no older than 16. A sliver of decency pricked at his conscience. He couldn't just throw her back out into the coming storm. "Get her inside," he grunted, stepping aside. The hours that followed were thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor sat huddled by the fire, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, sipping a mug of hot broth Marian had prepared with trembling hands. Marian still hadn't said more than a dozen words. She moved about the kitchen with a stiff, unnatural formality, avoiding looking at her sister, avoiding looking at Caleb. The air crackled with questions Caleb wanted to ask, but he held his tongue, waiting. When it grew dark, he made his decision. "She can sleep in the barn for the night," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "There's clean hay and plenty of blankets. We'll talk more in the morning." Marion's head snapped up, her eyes pleading. "Caleb, the barn is cold." "It's dry and it's out of the wind." He cut her off. "It's that or the road back to wherever she came from." A look of defeat settled on Marion's face. She nodded meekly. Eleanor, who had been watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes, said nothing, simply clutching the quilt tighter. Later, after a dinner eaten in absolute silence, Caleb lit a lantern and led the girl out to the barn. The rain had started, a steady, miserable drizzle. He showed her the stall he'd prepared, the fresh pile of hay, the stack of woolen blankets. She was still shivering, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. He was about to leave her, to shut the heavy barn door on this whole confusing affair, when she spoke. Her voice was small, almost lost in the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. "Thank you, sir." He paused at the door, his back to her. He didn't want thanks. He wanted an explanation. He wanted his quiet life back. "I'm sorry to be a burden," she whispered, and he heard the distinct catch of a sob in her throat. He turned, his stern expression softening slightly in the flickering lantern light. She looked so small and lost, swallowed up by the cavernous darkness of the barn. "I didn't know what else to do," she continued, tears now streaming freely down her dirt-streaked cheeks. She hugged her knees to her chest, a tremor running through her body. "I have no home. I have no one." Her gaze lifted to his, and it was filled with a desperate, absolute finality that chilled him to the bone. "I only knew she was here. I only knew my sister was the one place I could come." The rain fell through the night and into the next day, a cold, relentless curtain of gray that turned the hard-packed earth around the ranch into a slick, ankle-deep mud. The world shrank to the four walls of the house, trapping the three of them inside with a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than the storm clouds overhead. That morning, Marion approached Caleb as he cleaned his rifle at the main table, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron into a knot. She had waited until Eleanor was out of earshot, sent to the root cellar on a contrived errand for potatoes. "Caleb," she began, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it over the drumming of the rain on the roof. I must ask a favor of you." He continued his methodical work, pushing an oiled cloth through the barrel, not looking at her. "I reckon I know what it is." "She is not well," Marion said, her words rushing out in a quiet torrent. "The journey has taken a toll on her. To send her out in this storm, she would not survive it. Please, just a few more days, until the rain passes and she has her strength back." She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw a spark of desperate fire in her perpetually sad eyes. It was the look of a mother protecting her young. "She has nowhere else to turn. We are all she has." Caleb set the rifle down with a soft click. His practical mind warred with the unease coiling in his gut. The girl was a disruption, a mystery, an anchor of unknown weight tied to his new wife. But Marion was right. To turn anyone out in this weather was a death sentence. He was a hard man, but he was not a murderer. 3 days, he said, his voice flat and final. "Until the weather breaks. Then she must be on her way. We'll give her provisions, a few dollars. That is more than fair." Relief washed over Marion's face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. "Thank you, Caleb. God bless you." She turned away quickly, as if afraid he might rescind the offer. The 3 days stretched into a week. The rain eventually stopped, leaving behind a sodden, weeping landscape. But a new, more insidious storm was brewing inside the house. Caleb began to notice things, small details that pricked at him like burrs under a saddle blanket. He noticed how Marion's entire body would stiffen when Eleanor entered a room, how she would busy herself with some task, mending, kneading dough, scrubbing a pot that was already clean, her focus absolute, her eyes fixed on her work, refusing to meet her sister's gaze. She spoke to Eleanor only when necessary. In short, clipped sentences about household chores. There was no sisterly warmth, no shared smiles or easy chatter, There was only a thick, guarded tension. And he noticed Eleanor. She, in turn, watched him. When he sat by the fire in the evenings to read an old almanac, he would feel her eyes on him from across the room. It was not a flirtatious or inviting gaze. It was something more complex. It was watchful, analytical, as if she were trying to solve a difficult puzzle. She observed the way he drank his coffee, the way he mended a leather strap, the way he spoke to Marion. She was a quiet, constant presence, absorbing every detail of this new life and of the man at its center. The dynamic was unsettling. His wife avoided her sister, and her sister studied him. He felt like a man standing between two charged poles, the air around him humming with an energy he did not understand. The decision was taken out of his hands on the 5th day. Caleb was returning from checking a fence line when he heard a short, sharp cry from the barn. He quickened his pace, his hand instinctively going to the pistol on his hip. He threw open the heavy barn door to find Marion kneeling in the hay beside her sister's sleeping pallet. Eleanor was conscious, but barely. Her face was flushed with a dangerous heat, her skin slick with sweat, and her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "She's burning with fever," Marion cried, her composure finally shattered. "I came to bring her breakfast, and she was like this. She fainted when she tried to stand." Caleb knelt, pressing the back of his hand to Eleanor's forehead. The heat was alarming. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She tried to speak, but only a weak moan escaped her lips. He looked around the barn, at the damp chill in the air, the dusty hay, the draft that snaked in under the door. It was no place for a sick animal, let alone a sick girl. He swore under his breath. He was trapped. His decency was a cage. Without a word, he bent and slid his arms under Eleanor's slight form. She weighed next to nothing. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, her hot breath ghosting against his neck. He carried her out of the barn and into the house, past a white-faced Marion, and laid her gently on the cot he'd set up in the corner of the main room, the one he sometimes used during calving season. He could not leave her in the cold to die. The contract of his life had been amended by a force beyond his control. Eleanor was no longer a visitor in the barn. She was an invalid in his home. For the next few days, the rhythms of the house revolved around Eleanor's sickbed. Marion was a devoted, if silent, nurse. She bathed her sister's brow with cool cloths, spooned thin broth between her parched lips, and sat by her side through the long nights. Caleb found himself watching them, this strange, sad pair. It was during these fever-soaked days and nights that the story of their past began to emerge, not in a single telling, but in fragments, whispered in the dim light of the lantern. While Marion dozed in a chair, Eleanor would sometimes wake, her mind loosened by the fever, and she would talk to Caleb, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if watching a play from her memory. She spoke of a small, cramped apartment in a city far to the east, a place that always smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. She spoke of their mother, a frail woman with a cough that never left, who faded away like an old photograph until one day she was simply gone. And then she spoke of him. She never used his name. He was only ever him. The man their mother had married after their father died. He was a man with heavy hands and whiskey on his breath. She spoke of nights spent huddled with Marion under a thin blanket, listening to his heavy tread in the hallway, praying he would pass their door. She spoke of hunger, of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of a fear so constant it became the very air they breathed. Through it all, her stories were laced with a single, shining thread. Marion. It was Marion who would hide a piece of bread for her when he had eaten all the supper. It was Marion who would whisper stories in the dark to drown out the sounds from the other room. It was Marion who, at 16, had placed herself between a drunken rage and her little sister, taking the blows that were meant for Eleanor. "She was always my shield," Eleanor whispered one afternoon, her fever beginning to break, her voice thin and reedy. He did not like me. He said I had the devil's eyes. But Marion, she wouldn't let him near me. She told him he'd have to kill her first." Caleb listened, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He looked at Marion, dozing in the chair, her face careworn and exhausted. This quiet, timid woman who flinched at his touch had the heart of a she-wolf when it came to her sister. The locked doors inside her began to creak open, and the sorrow in her eyes took on a new, terrible meaning. That night, after Eleanor had fallen into a deep, healing sleep, the silence in the bedroom was different. It was no longer just awkward. It was heavy with all the things now known. Caleb lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, the girl's whispered words echoing in his head. He felt the mattress shift and turned to see Marion sitting up, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. Her shoulders were shaking. A low, wretched sound escaped her, the sound of a pain held in for too long. He sat up, an unfamiliar impulse moving him. "Marion." She turned to him, her face awash in silver light and tears, and then she collapsed against him, her head burying itself in his chest, her small fists clutching his nightshirt. Her sobs were raw and unrestrained, the breaking of a dam that had held for years. He was stiff and awkward at first, his arms hovering uselessly at his sides, but then, slowly, he wrapped them around her, holding her trembling body. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she wept into his chest. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to bring this trouble to you. I couldn't." "Couldn't what?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I can't send her away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. What she told you, it was only half of it. The things I protected her from." She choked on the words, unable to continue. She took a shuddering breath and finished, her voice a bare whisper that pierced him to the soul. "Because without me, Caleb, she would have died long ago." He held her then, held her until her sobs subsided into exhausted shudders. For the first time since their wedding night, they were not a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two people in a dark room, bound by a tragedy that had unfolded 1,000 miles away. He felt a fierce, protective surge for this broken woman in his arms. And, God help him, for the girl sleeping in the other room. Too, as Eleanor recovered, a new woman emerged from the fever's ashes. The pale, frightened girl who had arrived on his doorstep was replaced by someone with a surprising resilience. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was banked now, like embers beneath a layer of ash, and in its place, a spark of life began to glow. She was nothing like her sister, where Marion was quiet and reserved. Eleanor was curious and expressive, where Marion moved with a hesitant grace. Eleanor moved with a wiry, energetic purpose, and she was strong, not just in spirit, but in body. One afternoon, Caleb was struggling to break a stubborn young colt in the corral. The horse was wild, bucking and rearing, and Caleb was losing his patience. Marion watched from the porch, her hand over her mouth in alarm. Eleanor came to stand beside her, and after a moment, she walked down from the porch and climbed onto the fence of the corral. "He doesn't like the bit, Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice clear and confident. "It's pinching the corner of his mouth." Caleb, sweating and frustrated, shot her an irritated look. And what would a girl from Boston know about breaking horses? "We didn't always live in the city," she said simply. Before him. We lived in the country for a spell. I remember," she pointed. "See how he throws his head? Talk to him soft. Let him get the feel of it first." Grumbling, but seeing the logic in her words, Caleb eased the pressure on the reins. He began speaking to the horse in a low, soothing monotone. To his astonishment, the colt's ears swiveled, its panicked eyes softened, and it stopped fighting. Slowly, patiently, He worked with the horse, and within the hour, it was accepting the bit without a fuss. When he was done, he led the colt to the water trough, his mind reeling. He looked over at Eleanor, who was now scratching the horse's nose, murmuring to it. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, and it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. Caleb felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. It felt like a thaw after a long winter. He was seeing in Eleanor a reflection of the land itself, a resilience, a wild and untamed spirit that he understood far better than Marion's delicate, hothouse fragility. He started finding reasons to have her help him. She had a knack with the animals. She could muck a stall without complaint, mend a saddle with neat, strong stitches, and ride one of the older geldings with a natural, easy grace that Marion, who was terrified of the horses, could never muster. She brought him water in the fields, her presence a bright spot in the lonely, monotonous work. He tried to fight it. He was a married man, a decent man. He had made a vow. He focused on Marion, trying to draw her out, but she seemed to be retreating further into her shell as Eleanor blossomed. The house was too small for the 3 of them, and his own heart was becoming a crowded, contested territory. He felt a dull, constant guilt, but it was overshadowed by the undeniable life Eleanor brought into his world. She laughed sometimes, a bright, clear sound that startled him. She asked him questions about the ranch, about the mountains, about the stars. She was interested. She was alive. The moment it all came to a head was, like most life-altering moments, a small and simple thing. They were at the dinner table. The meal was nearly over. Eleanor rose to clear the plates. As she reached for his, her hand brushed against his. It wasn't an accident. He knew it, and he knew that she knew it. It was a deliberate, lingering touch. Her skin was warm, her fingers firm. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. The world fell away. There was no rattling of dishes, no crackling fire, no wind moaning outside the window. There was only the vast, silent space between them, charged with a current that jolted him to his core. In her eyes he saw everything, her tragic past, her resilient spirit, and a raw, undisguised longing that mirrored the one growing, against his will, in his own soul. It was a moment of profound, terrifying recognition. He broke the gaze first, clearing his throat and pushing his chair back abruptly. He felt a tremor in his own hands. The guilt came crashing back, hot and suffocating. He had betrayed Marion in his heart, and the look in Eleanor's eyes told him she was willing to help him betray her in the flesh. That night, sleep would not come. He lay beside his wife, who breathed the shallow, even breaths of a troubled sleep. He was acutely aware of every sound in the house, the creak of the floorboards as the house settled, the scurrying of a mouse in the walls, the distant cry of a coyote. And then, another sound, a soft, hesitant scratching at their bedroom door. Caleb froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew who it was. He could feel her presence on the other side of that wooden plank as surely as if he could see her. Marion stirred beside him but didn't wake. Slowly, silently, he slid out of bed. He crossed the cold floor in his bare feet and pressed his ear to the door. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He heard a soft intake of breath on the other side. Then her voice, trembling and fragile, a plea wrapped in a whisper. "I'm sorry to wake you," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just, the room is so cold out here, and the quiet—" She paused, and he could picture her on the other side, hugging herself in the darkness. "I ask for nothing, Caleb, I swear it." Her voice dropped even lower, becoming an intimate, desperate caress. "I only want, just for one night, to sleep near warmth, like my sister does." Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn the knob, to open the door, to pull her into the room and into his arms. The desire was a physical pain, a fire in his blood that threatened to consume his honor, his vows, his very soul. He could taste her on his tongue, feel the ghost of her warmth against his skin. His hand rose, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold iron of the latch. He saw her face in his mind, her eyes full of that terrible, beautiful longing. With a shuddering breath that felt like it was tearing him in two, he let his hand fall. He backed away from the door, his body shaking. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wood. A silent prisoner in his own home. On the other side of the door, he heard a single, muffled sob, and he knew that she was trembling, too, not from the cold, but from the same forbidden, impossible fire that was burning them both alive. The night of the closed door did not end. It bled into the following day and the day after that. A long, drawn-out twilight of unspoken words and charged glances. The flimsy plank of wood separating the main room from the bedroom had become a wall of granite, a monument to a line that had been approached but not crossed. A fragile, temporary peace had been bought at the price of an unbearable tension. Caleb felt like a stranger in his own skin. He was a man split in two. One half of him was the honorable rancher, the widower who had entered into a respectable, if passionless, contract with a woman who needed a home. This man was disgusted with himself, his mind replaying the moment his hand had trembled on the latch, the whisper of temptation, a venom in his ear. This man worked twice as hard, his axe biting deeper into the wood he chopped, his hands raw from mending fences under the cold sky, seeking punishment and distraction in physical labor. He would look at Marion, his wife, and feel a wave of profound, suffocating guilt. But the other half, the one that emerged in the quiet moments, was a man he no longer recognized. This man felt the ghost of Eleanor's heat through the door, remembered the desperate longing in her voice, and felt an answering pull in his own gut, a primal and undeniable yearning for the life and fire she carried within her. This man would catch her eye across the room and feel the jolt, the silent acknowledgement of the thing that simmered between them. He was ashamed of this man, but he could not kill him. Marion became a ghost. She moved through the house with a preternatural quiet, her feet making no sound on the floorboards. She had always been reserved, but now her silence was an active, palpable thing, a shield she held up against the world. She saw everything. Caleb knew she did. She saw the way his gaze would linger on Eleanor for a fraction of a second too long. She saw the way Eleanor would find a reason to stand near him, her presence a subtle, constant pressure. Marion saw it all, and she said nothing. Her non-confrontation was a far heavier judgment than any angry words could have been. She was a living, breathing testament to his failure, and her sorrowful eyes were a constant, quiet accusation. Life became a miserable play, the three of them reciting their lines of polite civility while a far more dangerous drama unfolded in the spaces between the words. The breaking point came on a bright, cold afternoon a week later. The air was crisp with the coming autumn, and a brittle sunlight streamed through the windows. Caleb was in town. A rare trip to procure winter supplies. He had made the journey alone, needing the solitude, the long ride a chance to clear his head. It hadn't worked. Marion was in the root cellar, taking stock of their preserves. When a floorboard creaked above her in the main house, she assumed it was Eleanor, tidying up. But a strange stillness followed, an absence of the usual sounds of sweeping or dusting. A prickle of unease, sharp and unwelcome, ran up her spine. She climbed the steep wooden steps and pushed open the cellar door, her eyes adjusting to the light. The main room was empty. Eleanor was not there. The quiet was absolute. Marion walked through the small house, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. She pushed open the door to the bedroom, their bedroom. And there was Eleanor. She was standing before the small, silvered mirror that had belonged to Sarah, her back to the door. She was not wearing her own simple calico dress. She was wearing Marion's wedding dress, The same plain gray wool garment Marian had been married in just a few short weeks before, on Eleanor's slender frame. The dress seemed transformed. It clung to her youthful figure, the severe cut somehow emphasizing her vitality rather than masking it. Her blonde hair, usually tied back in a practical braid, was loose, cascading over her shoulders in a wave of pale gold. She was not merely wearing the dress, she was inhabiting it. She turned this way and that, her hands smoothing the fabric over her hips, a small, wistful smile on her lips as she studied her reflection. She was seeing not just a girl in a borrowed dress, but a bride, a wife. She was seeing herself in Marian's place. For Marian, the sight was a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs. This was not about a piece of clothing. It was a transgression, a claiming of a life that was not hers. The dress was the one symbol of her position in this house, the tangible proof of the vows that had been spoken, however hollow they had felt. To see Eleanor in it was to see her own identity erased. Her precarious hold on this new life revealed for the fragile thing it was. A cold, silent rage, an emotion so foreign to her she barely recognized it, ignited in her chest. It wasn't a hot, screaming fury, but a low, white-hot burn. It was the jealousy of a woman who had nothing, watching someone who had nothing try to take the one small thing she had been given. Eleanor must have sensed her. Her smile faltered, and her eyes met Marian's in the mirror. The color drained from her face. She spun around, her hands flying to the buttons on the dress, her expression one of pure panic, a child caught in a terrible act of mischief.
"Marian, I was just... It was hanging there, and I was curious,"
she stammered, her fingers fumbling with the fastenings.
"I didn't mean anything by it. I'll take it off right now."
Marian didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stood in the doorway, her face a pale, unreadable mask, and watched as her sister struggled out of the dress, her movements clumsy with shame. Eleanor scrambled back into her own clothes and fled the room, leaving the gray dress in a heap on the floor, a shed skin between them. Marian walked over, picked it up, and folded it with slow, deliberate movements, her hands trembling. The silent fire in her chest did not go out. It settled deep inside her, a glowing ember of bitter knowledge. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was a weapon. Caleb, returned from town, sensed the shift immediately. The air was not just tense, it was glacial. Marian served the food without a word, her movements stiff and robotic. Eleanor refused to look up from her plate, her face still flushed with shame. Later, when they were in the bedroom, preparing for sleep, Marian finally spoke to him. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to him, her hands clasped in her lap.
"Caleb,"
she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. He stopped, his hand halfway through unbuttoning his shirt.
"Yes, Marian."
She didn't turn around.
"I know you are not happy with me,"
she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I know I am not the wife you had hoped for. I do not have the fire that a man requires. I am quiet, and I am sad, and I know that is a burden to you." He opened his mouth to deny it, to offer some sort of hollow comfort, but she continued, cutting him off.
"I release you from any obligation to my happiness,"
she said, each word a carefully placed stone. She finally turned her head, and in the dim lamplight, he saw that her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a strange, unnerving clarity. "I cannot give you what you need, but I ask you one thing, a vow, if you will, to replace the ones we made." He waited, his blood running cold.
"If I cannot make you happy,"
she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper,
"then please, please do not hurt her."
The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than any accusation. She was not fighting for him. She was not fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for Eleanor. She was sacrificing her own position, her own heart, to protect the little sister she had shielded her entire life. She was giving him her permission, And in doing so, she was placing an even heavier burden of guilt upon his shoulders. She was telling him that she knew, and that she had already surrendered. Marion's surrender was Eleanor's liberation. It was as if a spell had been broken, a restraint had been lifted. She no longer hid her intentions behind watchful eyes. She became bolder, her actions a constant, gentle assault on Caleb's crumbling defenses. She created opportunities for contact, her ingenuity both terrifying and intoxicating. She would bring him a cup of coffee in the barn, her fingers brushing his as he took the mug. When he came in from the fields, his shirt soaked with sweat, she would be there with a basin of water, taking the shirt from him, her hands grazing his bare chest as she did. "You work too hard, Caleb," she would murmur, her voice a low purr. One day, he cut his hand on a piece of rusted barbed wire. It was a shallow but bloody gash. He came into the house to wrap it, and Eleanor rushed to his side, pushing Marion gently away. "Let me," she insisted. She cleaned the wound with a tenderness that made him ache, her touch light and sure. Then she lifted his hand to her lips and blew softly on the cut, her warm breath caressing his skin. "To keep the spirits away," she whispered, looking up at him through her lashes, a playful, knowing smile on her face. It was an act of such intimate, brazen care that it left him speechless. He began to feel like a man caught in a current, his feet slipping on the riverbed, the force of the water too strong to fight. His resolve was eroding with every touch, every whispered word, every shared glance. He was drowning, and he was not sure he wanted to be saved. The storm that finally broke him was not just inside the house, but outside as well. It rolled in from the mountains without warning. A furious, black-bellied squall that threw sheets of rain against the windows and rattled the very foundations of the house. The wind howled like a banshee, a wild and violent chorus to the turmoil in Caleb's soul. And with the storm, Marion fell ill. It started with a shiver, then a racking cough that shook her frail body. By nightfall, she was burning with the same fever that had laid Eleanor low weeks before. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, and she drifted in and out of a fitful, delirious sleep. Eleanor was tireless. She took command of the sick room, her energy boundless. She bathed her sister's face, changed the sweat-soaked linens, and forced sips of water between her cracked lips. Caleb could only stand by, feeling large and useless. He watched Eleanor, her face etched with worry and determination in the flickering lamplight, and his heart was a knot of admiration, guilt, and a desire so fierce it was a physical pain. As the night wore on and the storm raged, Eleanor grew weary. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She refused to leave her sister's side, finally curling up on a pile of blankets on the floor at the foot of the bed. A vigilant guardian. It was long after midnight when Caleb, unable to sleep, pushed open the bedroom door. The scene that met him was one of stark, primitive beauty. The only light came from a single lantern on the bedside table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of sickness and rain. On the bed, Marion tossed and moaned, lost in her fever dream. And on the floor, Eleanor was asleep, her cheek pillowed on her arm, her blonde hair a pool of gold in the dim light. He stood there for a long moment, watching them, his wife and her sister, his duty and his desire, the storm outside and the storm within. As if sensing his presence, Eleanor stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him from the floor, her gaze hazy with sleep at first, and then sharpening with a sudden, raw intensity. And in her eyes, in that one, silent look, he saw everything. He saw a plea for comfort in the long, terrifying night. He saw an understanding of the guilt that was eating him alive, and he saw a bold, unapologetic invitation. It was the same desperate longing he had heard in her voice at the door, but now it was unveiled, undeniable, and it was his for the taking. Something inside him snapped. The taut cord of honor and restraint he had clung to for weeks finally broke. The fight was over. He moved into the room, his steps silent. He knelt on the floor beside her, the storm in his heart finally unleashed. He didn't speak her name. He didn't have to. He reached for her, his hands tangling in her hair, and he pulled her to him. He crashed his mouth down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the culmination of weeks of stolen glances and forbidden touches, of guilt and longing and unbearable tension. Her response was instantaneous and fierce. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her body arching against his. It was a frantic, clumsy collision of two people consumed by a need that had grown too powerful to deny. They were lost, adrift in the heart of the storm, and for a fleeting, searing moment, nothing else in the world existed. And then, a sound from the bed, a small, rustling sound, a soft sigh. They broke apart, gasping for air, their heads snapping toward the bed. In the dim lantern light, Marion was awake. She was lying on her side, her body still, her eyes wide open, and she was watching them. Her gaze was not fevered or delirious. It was perfectly, horribly lucid. She had seen everything. Caleb's blood turned to ice. A wave of shame so profound it was nauseating washed over him. He felt Eleanor stiffen in his arms. Marion did not cry. She did not scream or rage. Her expression did not change. She simply held their gaze for a long, silent moment, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned her back to them, facing the wall. It was an act of dismissal so complete, so final. It was more devastating than any condemnation. The sound of the rain and the wind rushed back in to fill the void. Caleb and Eleanor remained frozen on the floor, kneeling like penitents before a silent altar. The heat of their passion had vanished, replaced by the chilling cold of their transgression. There were no words to say. There was nothing to do but kneel there in the darkness, exposed and shamed, while the woman he had married, and the sister she had always protected, lay broken in the bed beside them. The storm passed before dawn. The morning broke clear and cold. The world outside washed clean, glittering under a pale sun. The silence inside the house was absolute. Caleb had not slept. He had spent the remainder of the night sitting in a chair in the main room, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the scene in the bedroom replaying in his mind on an endless, torturous loop. When the first light of day crept through the windows, he finally rose and walked to the bedroom door. He pushed it open. Eleanor was gone from the floor. The bed was empty. For a wild, panicked moment, he thought they had both left, but then he saw it. Lying on the pillow where Marion's head had been was a single, folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He unfolded it. The handwriting was Marion's, neat and careful. Even now, the message was short, the words stark against the white paper. I am leaving so you both can live, or so all three of us no longer have to choose. The note in Caleb's hand was as light as a dead leaf, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. For a long moment, the world consisted of nothing but the neat, careful script on the page. The words were a quiet, final judgment. He read them once, twice, a third time, as if trying to force a different meaning from the ink, but the message was plain. She was gone. A sound from the doorway, a choked sob, broke the spell. Eleanor stood there, her face a mask of utter devastation, her eyes wide with a horror that mirrored his own. The shared guilt was a visible, shimmering thing in the air between them. The fire of the previous night had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of consequence. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, she wouldn't. Not in her condition." Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through Caleb's shock. Marion was still weak from the fever. To venture out into the wilderness, alone and ill, was suicide. He crumpled the note in his fist. The rage at himself, at the situation, a hot bile rising in his throat. "Get your coat," he ordered, his voice a low, gravelly command. "We're riding out." There was no discussion, no planning. There was only a frantic, desperate haste. Within minutes, they were saddled up. Two grim figures riding out into the cold. Clean light of the new day. The landscape, washed clean by the storm, seemed to mock them with its pristine beauty. Every direction was a vast, empty expanse. She could have gone anywhere. Eleanor was transformed. The bold, seductive girl from the night before was gone, replaced by a frightened child consumed by a monstrous guilt. The fire in her eyes had been replaced by a frantic, tear-filled terror. She rode beside him, her body hunched against the wind, her gaze sweeping the horizon, calling Marion's name until her voice was raw and hoarse. Every shadow in the distance became her sister. Every gust of wind seemed to carry her name.
"This is my fault,"
she repeated, the words a desperate litany. "All of it. I am a wicked, terrible person. I pushed her to this. Oh, Caleb, what have I done?" Caleb didn't answer. Her self-flagellation was a mirror of his own. Every word she spoke was a lash against his own conscience. He had known better. He was the man, the husband. He had held the honor of his house in his hands, and he had let it shatter on the floor for a moment of weakness. His guilt was a cold, heavy stone in his gut. Their first stop was Redemption Creek. The town was just beginning to stir, smoke curling from a few chimneys into the crisp air. They went first to the stagecoach office, thinking perhaps she had tried to flee back east. The station master, a balding man with tired eyes, shook his head. No one had bought a ticket that morning. No lone woman had come through. They checked the general store, the livery stable, even the saloon, though it was a futile gesture. No one had seen her. The few people they spoke to gave them curious looks. Caleb Thorne, the reclusive rancher, in town with a young, distraught blonde woman, asking after his new mail-order bride who had seemingly vanished. The seeds of gossip were being sown. Caleb could feel it. From the town, they rode to a small, struggling mission a few miles south, a place run by Quakers that sometimes offered refuge to destitute travelers. The kindly woman who ran it listened to their story with a compassionate expression but could offer no help. They had no new arrivals. With every dead end, Eleanor's despair deepened. "Where else could she go?" she cried, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "She has no money, no one. We have to find her. Caleb, please, I don't care about anything else. I don't care if you hate me for the rest of your life. Just bring her back. Please bring my sister home." Her pleas tore at him. The seductive creature who had tempted him was gone. In her place was a girl terrified of losing the one person who had ever been her shield. He saw then that her love for her sister was as fierce and real as the guilt that was now consuming her. His own complicated feelings for Eleanor, the desire, the fascination, were burned away by the urgency of the moment. All that mattered was finding Marion. They searched for 2 days. They rode until the horses were lathered and exhausted, and they themselves were numb with cold and fatigue. They followed every faint track, explored every abandoned line shack, called her name into every canyon until the echoes mocked them. At night, they made a cold camp, the fire a small point of light in an overwhelming darkness. They barely spoke. They would eat a little hardtack and jerky. Then Eleanor would curl up in her blankets, her silent sobs the only sound besides the crackling of the fire and the lonely cry of the wind. Caleb would sit watch, his rifle across his knees, staring into the flames, his soul as barren as the landscape around them. On the 3rd day, a flicker of an idea came to him. He remembered the preacher from their wedding, Reverend Miller. He was a circuit preacher, but he had mentioned a small chapel he was trying to build up in the foothills of the Laramie Mountains, a place for the scattered ranchers and prospectors who lived too far from town. It was a long shot, a desperate one, but it was all they had left. They rode towards the mountains, the terrain growing rougher, the air thinner. It was late afternoon when they saw it. A small, crudely built log structure with a simple wooden cross nailed above the door. It stood in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, a lonely outpost of faith in a godless land. A thin plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney. As they dismounted, the chapel door opened, and a man in a dusty black coat emerged. It was Reverend Miller. He recognized Caleb immediately, his weary face breaking into a surprised smile.
Mr. Thorne, what brings you all the way out here?
His eyes fell on Eleanor, taking in her disheveled state. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We're looking for my wife, for Marion. Have you seen her?" The preacher's expression softened with understanding. He nodded slowly. "She is here," he said gently. "She arrived 2 days ago, on foot, near frozen and exhausted. The poor woman was in a terrible state." He gestured toward the chapel. "She is inside, resting. She asked for shelter and a chance to earn her keep. She's been helping me in the kitchen, a fine cook. Your wife is—" Relief, so powerful it almost brought Caleb to his knees, washed over him. He heard Eleanor let out a strangled sob of joy beside him. They had found her. She was alive. "Come," the Reverend said, "but be gentle. Her spirit seems wounded." He led them inside. The chapel was a single room, Spartan and clean, smelling of pine wood and beeswax. A few rough-hewn benches served as pews. At the far end of the room was a small, partitioned-off area that served as the preacher's living quarters and kitchen. And there, standing by a cast-iron stove, stirring a pot that sent a cloud of savory steam into the air, was Marion. She heard them enter and turned. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw them, but there was no shock, no fear. Her face was pale and thin, but the frantic, haunted look was gone. In its place was a profound and unsettling stillness. She looked at Caleb, then at Eleanor, her expression calm, resigned. Eleanor rushed forward.
"Marion! Oh, Marion! Thank God! We were so worried. I was so worried."
She tried to embrace her sister, but Marion took a small, deliberate step back, and Eleanor's arms fell awkwardly to her sides. "I am well, Eleanor," Marion said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the voice of a stranger. Caleb stepped forward, his heart aching at the distance in her eyes. "Marion," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Come home, please." She turned her gaze to him. It was a clear, steady look, devoid of the sorrow he was used to seeing. It was something far more unnerving. Acceptance. "This is my home now, Caleb," she said simply, gesturing to the humble room. "The Reverend has been kind enough to give me a place." "This is no place for you," Caleb argued, his frustration rising. "Your place is with me. At the ranch, you are my wife." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "I was your wife by contract, Caleb, a housekeeper, a presence to fill the silence. But I was never truly a wife to you in your heart. I cannot be what you need." She looked past him, at the simple wooden cross on the far wall. "I have lived my entire life as a shadow, a shield for my sister, a servant in other people's homes, a bride for a man who did not love her. Here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "there is only quiet. For the first time in my life, I can hear my own thoughts. For the first time, I am at peace in myself." Her words were a knife in his gut. He had thought her silence was a sign of weakness, of timidity. He saw now that it was a prison, and he had been one of her jailers. Desperate, he played his last card. He was willing to sacrifice anything to put things right, to restore the order he had destroyed. "It was my fault," he said, his voice raw. "All of it. Eleanor, she will leave. I will send her away. I will give up everything, anything you ask. Just come back." I will honor you. Marion, I swear it." He glanced at Eleanor. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with pain at his words. But she nodded in mute, tearful agreement. She was willing to be sacrificed. But Marion slowly shook her head, her gaze filled with a pity that was almost unbearable. "You still do not understand a woman's heart, Caleb," she said softly. She looked at her sister, and, for the first time, a flicker of the old, protective warmth entered her eyes. "I still love you," she said, her gaze returning to him. The admission so simple and quiet, it almost broke him. "But I also understand that poor girl more than she understands herself. Sending her away will not fix what is broken in the three of us. It will only create a new wound." There was nothing more to say. Her logic was unassailable, her decision final. They stood in the quiet chapel, three broken people, the air thick with all the things they could not fix. In the end, she agreed to return, but not for him, and not for Eleanor. She returned because the kindly reverend explained that it was not proper for an unmarried woman to live with him, that it would cause a scandal that could harm his fledgling church. She returned out of a sense of duty, not desire. The ride back to the ranch was a long, funereal procession. They rode single file, Marion in the lead, then Eleanor, with Caleb bringing up the rear. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket of guilt, resentment, and unspoken pain. No one looked at each other. Life at the ranch became an exercise in careful, excruciating politeness. They moved around each other like ghosts, their actions mechanical, their words few and chosen with extreme caution. Marion took over the running of the house with a quiet efficiency, her presence a constant, silent rebuke. Eleanor retreated into herself, the vibrant, lively girl replaced by a timid, apologetic wraith who spoke only when spoken to and spent her days working herself to exhaustion on chores outside, as if seeking physical penance for her sins. Caleb was trapped between them, the warden of a prison of his own making. The house, which had once felt too small, now felt cavernous and empty, the emotional distance between them more vast than the prairie outside. This cold war of the soul lasted for nearly 2 weeks. The breaking point came, as it always did, in the dead of night. Caleb was woken by the sound of weeping. It was a soft, muffled sound, but in the profound silence of the house, it was as loud as a scream. He knew it was Eleanor. He lay in bed, his fists clenched, listening to the sound of her heartbreak, a fresh wave of guilt washing over him. He heard a floorboard creak in the room. He turned his head. Marion was sitting up in bed, her silhouette stark against the moonlight. She listened for a long moment. Then she slid out of bed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. She didn't look at him. She walked silently out of the room. Caleb held his breath. He heard her soft footsteps cross the main room, followed by the gentle click of a door latch. She had gone to Eleanor. He didn't know whether to expect a confrontation, an accusation, or something else entirely. He strained to listen, but heard nothing but the muffled sound of weeping, and then silence. After what felt like an eternity, the door to their bedroom opened again. It was Marion. "Caleb?" she whispered into the darkness. "Come." He rose, pulling on his trousers, his heart pounding. He followed her into the main room. The door to the small cot where Eleanor slept was ajar. A single candle flickered within. He stopped in the doorway, and the scene before him rooted him to the spot. Eleanor was sitting up on the cot, her face tear-stained and swollen, and beside her, holding her hand, was Marion. She had her arm around her younger sister's trembling shoulders, holding her close. The chasm that had existed between them was gone. In its place was a bond of shared sorrow, a profound and ancient connection that he could never penetrate. Marion looked up at him. Her eyes were clear, and in their depths, he saw not anger or resentment, but a heartbreaking resolve. She patted the empty space on the cot. "Sit," she commanded softly. He obeyed, feeling like a schoolboy called before the headmaster. He sat down, the small cot groaning under his weight. He was now sitting beside Eleanor, with Marion on her other side. The three of them, together in the small, candle-lit space. Marion took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at her sister, then at him. "We cannot continue like this," she said, her voice low but steady. "This silence will kill us all." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "This child has been crying herself to sleep every night, convinced she is a demon sent from hell. And you," she said, turning to Caleb, "walk around this house like a condemned man, carrying a weight that will eventually crush you." She looked down at their joined hands. "I have been praying in that chapel, praying for guidance, for a sign, but no answer came from God. The only answer is the one that is already in our hearts." She took his hand, her touch surprisingly firm. She placed it over Eleanor's. Now the three of them were connected, a circuit of misery and longing. "Look at me, both of you," she commanded. They obeyed. In the flickering candlelight, he saw the raw pain on Eleanor's face, and he saw the profound, weary sadness on Marion's. He knew they saw the same torment in his own. "We tell the truth now," Marion whispered. "All of it. No more secrets." She looked at Eleanor. "You love him. Say it." Eleanor let out a sob, but she met Caleb's eyes and nodded. The single word a choked whisper. "Yes." Marion then turned to Caleb. "And you have feelings for her. A desire for the life in her that I do not possess. Do not deny it." He couldn't. The lie died in his throat. He could only look at Marion, his wife, and give a slow, shameful nod. "Yes, and I," Marion said, her voice breaking for the first time, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Despite everything, I love you, Caleb. I love the good, decent man I know you are. Underneath this pain," her gaze shifted to Eleanor, "and I love this child more than my own life. I always have." The truth, finally spoken, hung in the air, terrible and liberating. They sat there in silence, their hands joined, the tears now flowing freely from all three of them. They were not tears of anger or betrayal, but of a shared, unbearable grief. Marion leaned forward, her other hand coming up to gently cup his cheek. Eleanor, on his other side, leaned her head against his shoulder, her sobs shaking his entire frame. He felt Marion's forehead come to rest on his other shoulder. And there they were, three broken souls, huddled together in the darkness, finding a strange and terrible solace in their shared ruin. The words were gone, burned away by the raw, honest confession. All that was left was touch, a hand gripping his, a head resting on his shoulder, a tear falling on his skin. It was not a night of explosive passion, but of a quiet, profound implosion. It was a long, silent surrender to a truth that none of them had wanted, but none could deny. It was the death of the life they thought they would have, and the birth of something new, something terrifying and unknown. In its place, it was the unification of three souls, bound together not by vows or by law, but by a shared, impossible love. The fragile peace forged in that candlelit room was a delicate, unseasonable flower, blooming in the harshest of climates. In the days that followed their shared confession, a new, tentative rhythm established itself at the ranch. The oppressive silence was replaced by a quiet, watchful tenderness. They spoke in low tones, their movements around each other gentle and deliberate, as if they were handling spun glass. There was still shame and sorrow, but it was a shared burden now, not a solitary one. The house was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, a tiny island of radical understanding in a vast sea of convention. But the world outside their island was not a kind one. Secrets, like water, always find a way to leak out, and the Wyoming Territory was a place of porous walls and long memories. The first sign of trouble came from Reverend Miller. He had ridden out to the ranch a week after Marion's return, ostensibly to check on her welfare. The three of them had met him on the porch, a silent, united front. They were polite but reserved, offering him none of the details he clearly craved. He left with a furrowed brow and a suspicious glint in his weary eyes. The sight of the three of them, Caleb, the quiet husband, Marion, the returned wife, looking pale but resolute, and Eleanor, the sister who had not left, did not fit the simple narrative of a marital spat. The whispers started in Redemption Creek soon after. A story, like a tumbleweed, began to roll, gathering dust and thorns as it went. It started with the Reverend's hushed concerns, spoken to the general store owner's wife. It was fed by Caleb's frantic search for his bride with another woman at his side. It grew fat on the memory of Marion's strange, solitary arrival, the word that began to be used, first in hushed tones behind cupped hands, then more boldly in the saloon, was an ugly one. It was a word that branded them as sinners, as deviants living in an unholy trinity. The consequences arrived on a cold, blustery morning in the form of a stout, red-faced man on a tired-looking horse. He rode up to the house as if he owned it, dismounting before Caleb could even get down from the porch. The man was dressed in ill-fitting town clothes, and his face was a mask of self-righteous fury. "I'm looking for Caleb Thorne," he boomed, his voice carrying the weight of unearned authority. "You've found him," Caleb said, his hand resting warily on the porch rail, his body instinctively positioned between the stranger and the front door, behind which the sisters were watching through the window. "My name is Jebediah Finch," the man announced. "I'm the cousin of Martha O'Donnell, mother to Marion and Eleanor. That makes me their kin, their guardian, now that they're without proper family." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boots. "I've come from Laramie, heard some disturbing things. Heard my niece, Marion, ran off from you, and that you've been keeping her younger sister here, alone." His eyes narrowed into accusatory slits. "I'm here to take Eleanor back to civilization, take her away from this den of iniquity. And if you try and stop me, I'll have the law on you for what you've done to these two defenseless girls." Before Caleb could form a response, the front door opened. Marion and Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, standing on either side of him. They were not the frightened, timid women the man expected to find. Marion's face was pale, but her chin was held high. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and cold. "We have never met. My mother spoke of no cousin named Jebediah. You are a stranger to us." "A stranger?" the man blustered, taken aback by her composure. "I am your blood. I've come to rescue your sister from this man who has clearly taken advantage of you both." It was Eleanor who spoke next. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with a fire Caleb had not seen since the night of the storm. "No one has taken advantage of us," she said, her voice ringing with a fierce, protective power. "This man, Caleb Thorne, is my brother-in-law. He has given us shelter and protection when we had none. He has treated us with more kindness than any man we have ever known, and certainly more than a cousin who has never once in our lives inquired as to our welfare." "But the talk," Finch stammered, his righteous fury deflating into confusion. "The preacher said, he said you were living here in sin." "What the preacher says is his business," Marion cut in, her voice like ice. "How we choose to live our lives is ours. This is our home now. All three of us. This is our choice." She looked from Finch's stunned face to Caleb, and then to her sister, a silent, powerful declaration passing between them. "You are not welcome here. Mr. Finch, leave now." The man stood there, his mouth agape, utterly defeated by the united, defiant front of the two women he had come to rescue. He looked from their resolute faces to Caleb's hard, unyielding expression, mumbling a curse under his breath. He heaved himself back onto his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. They had won the battle, but the confrontation on the porch was a declaration of war. Jebediah Finch, his pride wounded, did not ride back to Laramie. He rode to Redemption Creek and spread his poison. He told a lurid tale of two innocent girls held captive by a depraved rancher, a story that confirmed the town's darkest suspicions. The town's judgment was swift and absolute. When Caleb next rode in for supplies, the change was palpable. Men who had once nodded a greeting now turned their backs. The woman at the general store served him with pursed lips and averted eyes. When he asked for a sack of flour and a side of bacon, she looked at a point over his shoulder and said, "Afraid we're fresh out. Mr. Thorne." He knew it was a lie. He could see the sacks piled high in the back. He went to the livery to get his horse shod. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy, with a backlog of work that would take him a week. They were being ostracized, cut off. They had drawn a line in the sand, and the community had chosen to stand on the other side of it. Caleb returned to the ranch that evening with a half-empty wagon and a heavy heart. He explained the situation, and the three of them sat around the dinner table in a grim silence. They had their island, but the sea around them was rising. Caleb tried to maintain the ranch on his own. He was a capable man, and the land had always provided, but as autumn deepened, the coming winter loomed as a threat he might not be able to face alone. A hard winter required stockpiled supplies, goods they could no longer buy. The isolation, once a comfort, was now a weapon being used against them. The weight of their survival rested squarely on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he felt the strain of it. And then, in the midst of this external siege, tragedy struck within the walls of their sanctuary. It happened without warning. Marion had been quieter than usual for a few days, a familiar shadow of sadness returning to her eyes. One evening, she complained of a sharp, cramping pain in her belly. She tried to dismiss it, but the pain worsened through the night. Caleb, watching her face grow pale with agony, felt a cold dread creep into his heart. By morning, there was blood on the sheets. He had known, in some unexamined corner of his mind, that she was with child. The thought had been a source of both quiet hope and complicated fear. A child, conceived on that first passionless wedding night, a testament to a life that might have been. Now, that fragile possibility was being violently torn away. There was nothing he could do. There was no doctor to call, no one to turn to. He could only sit by the bed, his big hands useless, and watch his wife suffer. It was Eleanor who took charge. She became a pillar of strength and tenderness. She bathed Marion's brow, held her hand through the waves of pain, and whispered soothing words, the same way Marion must have comforted her when they were children. She cleaned the soiled linens without a word, her face a mask of grim determination, shielding both Caleb and Marion from the worst of the grim reality. She was no longer the sister, no longer the other woman. She was a caregiver, a force of nature driven by a love so fierce it was breathtaking to behold. The miscarriage was a long and bloody affair. By the time it was over, Marion was left weak and empty, her body and spirit hollowed out by the loss. The three of them were plunged into a new, deeper grief. The child had been a secret, silent hope for them all, a potential bridge between their strange new world and the one they had left behind. Its loss was a brutal confirmation of their isolation, a sign, it seemed, that their unnatural union was barren, cursed by God and man. The days that followed were the darkest they had yet endured. Marion lay in bed, listless, staring at the ceiling, the stillness in her more profound than ever before. Eleanor tended to her with a devotion that never wavered, but the light in her own eyes had dimmed. Caleb was consumed by a guilt that was black and suffocating. This, too, was his fault. He was the one who had brought this life upon them. He had failed to protect Marion, failed to provide for her, and now her body had paid the price for his sins. He looked at the two grieving women, at the fortress of their shared sorrow that he could not penetrate, and he felt like an intruder, the architect of all their pain. One night, he could bear it no longer. He packed a small saddlebag with a few provisions. He wrote a short letter, deeding the ranch and everything on it to Marion and Eleanor. He would disappear. He would ride north, lose himself in the mountains. Without him, the source of the scandal would be gone. The town might forgive two abandoned women. They could have a chance at a normal life. He was slinging the bag over his shoulder in the pre-dawn gloom when the door to his room creaked open. Marion and Eleanor were standing there, wrapped in shawls, their faces pale in the moonlight.
"Where are you going, Caleb?"
Marion asked, her voice a thin, fragile whisper. He couldn't meet their eyes.
"Away,"
he said, his voice thick. "It's me they hate. Without me here, you'll be safe. The town will leave you be." Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a spark of the old fire.
"And what will we do then?"
she demanded.
"Sell the ranch you built, go back east and become housemaids again? Live under the thumb of some man like Jebediah Finch?"
"You don't understand," Marion said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. She came and stood before him, her small hand resting on his arm, stopping him. Eleanor came to his other side, her hand joining her sister's. They held him there, two small anchors against the tide of his guilt.
"We have lost a child, Caleb,"
Marion said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears.
"We will not lose you, too. If you weren't here,"
Eleanor added, her voice choked with emotion,
"we wouldn't be safe. We would just be two lost women.
Without you, there is no home. There is just this empty land." He looked down at them, at their hands clutching his arms, at the fierce, desperate love in their eyes, and he understood. His leaving wouldn't save them. It would destroy the one thing they had managed to build in the wreckage, their family. He slowly unslung the saddlebag from his shoulder and let it fall to the floor. The town, however, was not finished with them, spurred on by Reverend Miller, whose righteous indignation had only grown. A group of men rode out to the ranch a week later. They didn't come as a mob with ropes and torches, but as a delegation of moral authority. They demanded that Caleb come into town to face a public accounting. It was not a request. He went. He would not have Marion and Eleanor face them. He rode into Redemption Creek alone, his back straight, his face a grim mask. The entire town, it seemed, was gathered in front of the church. It was an informal court, a tribunal of public opinion. Reverend Miller stood on the church steps, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. He delivered a fiery sermon, though his pulpit was the porch and his congregation was the dusty street. He spoke of abomination, of sin, of the sanctity of marriage vows. He did not name Caleb directly, but his meaning was clear. He was casting out the demon in their midst, cleansing his flock. He declared Caleb Thorne a man who had broken God's law and man's law, a moral leper who should be shunned. When he finished, a grim, self-satisfied silence fell over the crowd. The judgment had been passed. Caleb stood by his horse, alone, accepting the verdict. He had expected nothing less. And then, a new voice broke the silence. It was a creaky but surprisingly strong voice, and it came from the back of the crowd.
"That's enough. Thomas,"
the voice said. The crowd parted to let a woman through. It was Martha Henderson, a widow in her late 70s, a woman who had come to the territory as a young bride and had outlived her husband, her children, and most of her own generation. She was a relic of a harder, more pragmatic time. Her face was a spider web of wrinkles, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as a hawk's. She walked with the aid of a cane, but there was nothing frail about her. She stopped in front of the Reverend, who looked down at her with a mixture of respect and annoyance. "Martha," he said, "this is a matter of morality, a matter for the church."
"Is it?"
she said, her sharp eyes sweeping over the crowd.
"I see a matter of survival."
She turned her gaze on Caleb. It was not a kind look, but it was not a judgmental one either. It was a look of appraisal. "I don't know what goes on in that man's house," she said, her voice carrying in the still air. "And frankly, it ain't my business, and it ain't yours either." She jabbed a finger toward the preacher. "You talk of God's law. Thomas, I've lived on this land for 50 years. I've seen God's law. It's a hard winter and a dying calf. It's drought and fever and a sky that doesn't give a damn about your prayers. I've buried more people than you've saved." She took a step closer to the preacher, lowering her voice. But somehow it seemed to carry even further. "Those 2 girls out at the Thorn place, what would you have them do? Turn them out? Send them to a place like Laramie to be passed around by men like that blowhard cousin? You know what happens to women alone out here." She didn't have to elaborate. Everyone did. She turned to the crowd. "He took in his wife's sister. He gave her a roof. Now they're minding their own affairs, hurting no one. Maybe it ain't proper. Maybe it ain't right by the book." She tapped her cane on the dusty ground. "But there ain't no law, not God's, not man's, that says 3 people can't try to find a way to live in this God-forsaken land without doing harm to anyone else." She stared down the preacher, who stood speechless. She looked at the faces in the crowd, one by one, daring them to contradict her. No one did. A slow, shuffling silence fell over the town. Martha Henderson had not excused them, but she had reframed their sin. She had turned it from a moral abomination into a question of survival. And survival was a language everyone in Redemption Creek understood. The crowd began to disperse, not in a rush, but in small, quiet groups. They didn't look at Caleb. They didn't offer him a hand, but the public condemnation was over. Martha's words had not brought acceptance, but they had brought a truce. Caleb stood there as the street emptied, the old woman's words echoing in the silence. He was still an outcast, but he was no longer a target. The siege had been lifted. He turned his horse around and began the long ride home. Martha Henderson's words had not built them a bridge back to the world, but they had granted them the right to their own island. The town's open hostility cooled into a sullen, watchful silence. They were no longer targets, merely curiosities, a strange and cautionary tale to be whispered about from a safe distance. The shunning, however, remained. They were left alone, a sentence that was, for them, a blessing. The first snows of winter came early that year, a soft, white curtain that descended from a gray sky, quietly and methodically erasing the world. The road to Redemption Creek disappeared. The distant mountains dissolved into a white haze. The ranch became a solitary outpost, a ship locked in a sea of ice. The snow that imprisoned them also protected them, insulating them from the judgment of the world, forcing them inward, compelling them to build a new life from the ashes of the old. A new world took shape within the 4 walls of the house, governed by its own rhythms, its own laws of love and labor. It was a life of shared purpose, a silent, intricate dance of 3 bodies moving in concert. They found their balance not in words, but in work. Eleanor, who had spent her youth confined to cramped city rooms, found her liberation in the vast, cold emptiness of the outdoors. She rose before the sun, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and took on the hard, physical tasks that had once been Caleb's alone. She had a surprising strength, a wiry resilience that the harsh land seemed to nurture rather than crush. She learned to read the snow for tracks, to chop wood with a steady, rhythmic swing, to tend to the livestock with a gentle, fearless hand. Caleb would watch her from the barn, her small, determined figure moving against the vast white landscape, her cheeks chapped red by the wind, a life force so bright it seemed to generate its own heat. She was the hunter, the guardian of their perimeter, the one who wrestled a living from the frozen earth. Marion's domain was the house. She, who had fled from its suffocating tensions, now reclaimed it, transforming it from a place of sorrow and guilt into a sanctuary of warmth and life. The house began to smell of baking bread, of simmering stews, of drying herbs hung from the rafters. She was the heart of their small world, the keeper of the flame. She mended their worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took the meager stores they had and worked a quiet magic, making every meal feel like a feast. Her silence was no longer a retreat, but a form of meditation, in the steady, repetitive motions of kneading dough, of churning butter, of polishing the worn wooden floors. She found a peace that had eluded her entire life. She was the nurturer, the creator of their comfort, the one who made their house a home. And Caleb was the anchor, the steady, quiet center around which they both revolved. He tended to the horses, his hands as gentle and knowing on their powerful bodies as they were on the delicate machinery of a clock. The barn was his kingdom, a place of clean hay, worn leather, and the warm, animal scent of life. But his days were defined by the women. He would work alongside Eleanor in the biting cold, a comfortable silence between them, a shared understanding that needed no words. He would return to the house to find Marion by the fire, a soft smile on her lips, a cup of hot coffee waiting for him. He was no longer a man torn between two desires, but a man bound by two loves, each different, each essential. His love for Marion was a deep, quiet river of tenderness and shared sorrow. His love for Eleanor was a crackling fire of life and shared resilience. He had ceased trying to understand it, to justify it. He simply accepted it. As he accepted the turning of the seasons or the rising of the sun, he was the protector, the fulcrum of their unlikely family, the one who held their strange, beautiful world in balance. The evenings were the heart of their new life. After the supper dishes were cleared, they would gather around the great stone hearth. The fire would pop and hiss, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. The oil lamp on the table would create a small, intimate pool of light, holding the vast, dark night at bay. Outside, the wind might howl and the snow might drift high against the walls, but inside, there was only a profound and gentle peace. Often, they would work with their hands. Caleb would mend a piece of harness, the scent of leather and oil filling the air. Eleanor, her fingers surprisingly nimble, would knit warm stockings and mittens from coarse wool. And Marion, the artist among them, would piece together intricate quilts from scraps of old fabric, faded calico from Eleanor's dress, sturdy denim from Caleb's old work shirts, soft flannel from her own nightgowns. She stitched their lives together, creating patterns of warmth and beauty from the remnants of their past. Sometimes, Caleb would read aloud from an old copy of Shakespeare that had belonged to his mother, his low voice a steady, calming rumble in the quiet room. They didn't always understand the fancy words, but they understood the stories of love, tragedy, and fate. They would listen, their heads bent over their work, three solitary figures bound together by the story and the warmth of the fire. In these moments, they were not outcasts or sinners. They were simply a family. The loss of the child had left a scar, a tender place in their shared heart that they did not speak of. But as the winter deepened, a new, unspoken hope began to bloom in the quiet darkness, as unexpected as a winter rose. Caleb noticed it first in the small, secret smiles that passed between the sisters. He saw it in the way Marion would insist Eleanor take the extra portion of meat at dinner, the way she would wrap an extra shawl around her sister's shoulders before she went out into the cold. The confirmation came one night in late January. The world outside was in the grip of a deep, bitter freeze. The fire in the hearth was their only defense against the cold that seeped through the walls. They were sitting in their usual comfortable silence. The only sounds the crackle of the flames and the whisper of Marion's needle through a piece of fabric. Eleanor was staring into the fire, a dreamy, distant look on her face, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. Marion stopped her sewing. She watched her sister for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she put down her quilting hoop. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment in the air before coming to rest gently on top of Eleanor's. Caleb watched, his breath caught in his throat. Marion's thumb stroked the back of Eleanor's hand. She leaned in, her voice a soft, intimate whisper, meant only for the three of them in their small circle of light.
"Do you think,"
she murmured, her eyes full of a strange, wondrous light, "the baby will have brown eyes, like Caleb's?" The question was a prayer, an acceptance, a blessing. It was not a question of jealousy or possession, but of shared creation, of a future they would all claim as their own. It acknowledged the truth of the child's parentage, and in the same breath, wove it into the fabric of their three-person family. Eleanor looked from her sister's face to Caleb's, her own eyes shimmering with tears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand over both of theirs, covering them completely. And then, a sound that had been absent from the house for too long. A laugh. It started with Eleanor. A soft, watery chuckle that was half a sob. Marion joined in. A quiet, breathy sound of pure, unadulterated relief. And finally, Caleb. A low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. They laughed together in the firelight, tears streaming down their faces, a shared, silent, joyous acknowledgement of the beautiful, impossible, miraculous absurdity of their lives. They had been forged in the fires of tragedy and judgment, and they had emerged not broken, but whole. Spring came late that year, but when it came with a fierce, undeniable power. The world seemed to crack open overnight. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the snow began to melt, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The prairie, which had been a uniform, dead white, was suddenly alive with the tender green of new grass. The creek, which had been frozen solid, began to flow again, its voice a happy, gurgling song. One bright, warm morning, the three of them stood together on the porch of the small house. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. In the distance, a flock of geese flew north in a perfect, hopeful V. Eleanor stood on Caleb's left, Marion on his right. His arms were around both of them, and their hands were linked in front of him. They stood in silence, watching the rebirth of the world around them. It was their world. They had survived it. They had earned it. A few days later, Marion sat at the small wooden desk, a piece of paper and a pen before her. For the first time, she was writing a letter that she would not burn. It was addressed to a woman she had once worked for in Boston, a woman who had shown her a small measure of kindness. She did not write of the hardship or the judgment. She wrote only of the truth. "You once told me," she wrote in her neat, careful hand, "that a woman's lot in this world is to find a safe harbor. I have found mine, though it is not a harbor that is marked on any of your maps. It is a place built not of convention, but of necessity, and a love that does not ask for permission. We are not permitted to live this way, by God or by man, but we have lived, and no one has repented." The story of Caleb, Marion, and Eleanor did not end, for stories like theirs never truly do. They simply continue, woven into the fabric of the land they inhabit. Their tale became a ghost on the prairie, a whispered legend that defied the simple truths of the world. But for them, it was not a legend. It was simply life. It was the sight of a small house, its windows glowing with a warm, yellow light, standing solitary and defiant under a vast, star-dusted sky. It was a home in the heart of the great, unforgiving wilderness, a place where three lost souls had navigated the treacherous currents of sin and sorrow, and found their way not to a safe harbor, but to an island of their own making, a place where a love, in all its strange and wondrous forms, was more than enough. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories like this. And please share your thoughts with us. We read every one.